From June 1940 to May 1943, Axis and Allied pilots clashed over the North African desert in a fight for control of the southern Mediterranean basin. For Britain and the US, North Africa was more than just a battleground. It was a crucible for advanced combined arms warfare. From early clashes at Sidi Barrani to the Battle of Kasserine Pass, British and then American forces took air-ground cooperation to new highs during a campaign that shaped the tactical and strategic use of air power for the remainder of the war in Europe. British and Commonwealth forces laid the foundation for this success during an extended period of fighting against the combined strength of Italy and Germany. In particular, the RAF helped to create and refine a highly effective system of air-land integration that became a model for future operations for the remainder of the war. Hostilities in the region broke out in the early hours of June 11, 1940, following Italy's declaration of war against France and Britain. This pitched the British and Italian empires in a head-to-head contest, in a theatre of conflict that both Rome and London deemed vital to their strategic interests. The Italian army had well over 200,000 troops stationed in modern-day Libya, including the 5th Army in Tripolitania in the country's west and the 10th Army in Cyrenaica in the east. These forces were mostly colonial in character and lacked modern weapons and transport, meaning they were poorly equipped for maneuver warfare. The Regia Aeronautica, the Royal Italian Air Force, had 2 fighter wings of Fiat CR-32 and CR-42 biplanes, 1 wing of Breda BA-65 attack bombers, and 4 bomber wings of Savoia Marchetti S-79s as part of its Libyan contingent. Italy's broader air force was organized on a territorial basis, and there seems to have been minimal preparation for joint air-ground operations before the outbreak of the war. The Regia Aeronautica did, however, boast one of the world's largest bomber fleets at the time. On the opposing side, British Metropolitan, Imperial, and Commonwealth ground forces stationed in Egypt, under the Middle East Command in Cairo, were much smaller, consisting of 2 understrength divisions numbering about 36,000 troops. But British land forces were, relative to the Italians, highly mechanized and capable of maneuver warfare thanks to better offensive platforms and more transport vehicles. Britain's Royal Air Force presence in Egypt included 3 fighter squadrons of Gloster Gladiator biplanes, 4 squadrons of Bristol Blenheims, and other transport or mixed-use designs. This initially gave the Italians nearly a 3-to-1 advantage over the British in front-line aircraft strength. But when including the RAF's wider Middle East and Mediterranean footprint, along with Italy's presence in East Africa, total numbers came to around 570 aircraft for the Regia Aeronautica versus just over 300 for the RAF. But the numbers don't tell the whole story, as Britain's organizational strength was vastly superior to the Italians. These operational and logistical advantages stemmed from years of preparation to enhance the RAF's combat readiness. In particular, British commanders focused on air basing, logistics, and inter-service cooperation, establishing a strong infrastructure in Egypt. This included supply chains, repair facilities, and communication networks that minimized dependence on the home islands. The creation of a unified Middle East command in 1939 further streamlined operations and improved air-ground integration. In addition, British strategy emphasized rapid air superiority, with Italian airfields as key targets. The RAF leveraged all of these advantages to great effect, delivering continuous blows to Italian air power and ground forces once hostilities began. Air raids into Italian East Africa on June 11th, from British positions in the Sudan, smashed the Regia Aeronautica's aircraft strength and supply lines, and neutralized its regional combat capability inside the first month of the war. In North Africa, 35 Blenheim bombers struck Italian airfields at El Adem in Libya on June 11th. This was followed by an almost continuous rate of fighter and bomber operations over the following weeks, as the RAF pursued air superiority in service of British ground forces who were conducting forward raids on Italian positions in Libya. Mussolini greenlit a major ground offensive into British territory on September 9th, with Italian forces starting cross-border ground operations on September 13th. But by this point, the Regia Aeronautica was clearly losing the air war. Though Italian bombers were intermittently attacking British positions, these air raids had very little impact on the campaign. Fighter operations also showed little consistency, and there didn't appear to be any plan to achieve air superiority. The RAF, on the other hand, was ramping up its activity with about 60 sorties per day targeting airfields, supply lines, and Italian army positions. Britain's command of the skies gave the RAF the freedom to assault the Italian advance, which eventually dug in around the towns of Sidi Barrani and Sofafi. And while the Italian army waited, the British were being resupplied with more advanced aircraft. The arrival of Hawker Hurricanes, Blenheim Mark IVs, and a few Vickers Wellingtons started at the end of September. This is because the Royal Air Force was capitalizing on a new and more secure aircraft delivery route that made use of ports in West Africa to fly aircraft across the African continent into Egypt. By the time of Britain's first major military offensive, Operation Compass, RAF forces in the region were replenished, modernized, and in a good position to support the army's advance. A much smaller but more maneuverable British ground force swiftly defeated the Italian army entrenched at Sidi Barrani, and between December 1940 and February 1941, pushed the Italians all the way back to El Agheila in Libya. During this campaign, the Royal Air Force dominated the skies. At the start of Operation Compass, RAF commanders had 16 squadrons of aircraft that easily outclassed their Italian opponents in terms of quality. Massive and overwhelming raids on Italian airfields ahead of the ground assault largely neutralized the Regia Aeronautica as an offensive force, while sustained ground attacks severely limited Italian resupply efforts. Meanwhile, logistics and engineering crews established forward landing strips, ensuring continued air support. This decisive use of air power paved the way for a stunning ground campaign, resulting in the capture of over 130,000 Italian prisoners, along with hundreds of tanks, guns, and aircraft. It also provided an early model for air-land coordination, following the disjointed efforts of the British Expeditionary Force and RAF during the Battle of France. However, as British ground forces halted their advance at El Agheila, the Royal Air Force was about to contend with a new opponent. Faced with the imminent threat of a complete Axis collapse in North Africa, Adolf Hitler authorized German support for his Italian allies in January 1941. The arrival of disciplined and experienced German troops under Erwin Rommel's leadership changed everything. By early April 1941, British troops had been driven back to positions near Sollum on the Egyptian border, while the majority Australian force defended the port of Tobruk. Rommel's rapid advance was helped by the depletion of British troops and equipment, as armoured and mechanized units were diverted to fight in Greece and to support action in East Africa and the Levant. Up to this point, the Luftwaffe had built a presence in the Mediterranean through the 10th Air Corps' January deployment to Sicily. Its main objectives were to attack British shipping and defend the port of Tripoli. At the time, the 10th Air Corps included a mix of about 250 Ju-88s, HE-111s, Bf-110s, and Ju-87s, with the first Bf-109Es arriving on the island in February. Its total strength increased to about 450 aircraft by the end of March, before the bulk of the force was moved to Greece to support the German invasion effort. 10th Air Corps units also deployed directly to North Africa under the immediate but subordinate local command of the Fliegerführer Africa. By March, close to 70 Ju-87Bs had arrived in support of the Afrika Korps, accompanied by just over 30 Bf-110Ds. Single-engine fighters in the form of Bf-109Es followed close behind, and by April, a relatively small but experienced Luftwaffe force was stationed permanently in North Africa. The impact on the German campaign was almost immediate, as Luftwaffe ground strikes added early momentum to the Afrika Korps' advance across the desert, while the presence of Bf-109s robbed the RAF of its absolute control of the skies. For a brief period in April and May 1941, British air power was at its weakest point of the conflict. The RAF could call on just over 50 Hurricanes to meet its air superiority objectives. This moment gave the Luftwaffe a chance to, at least temporarily, strike a blow against British air units and infrastructure, but it had problems of its own. At this time, the Luftwaffe's overall force size in the region was being drained by the build-up and engagement of air units across the Eastern Front by late June of that year. By July, the Fliegerführer Africa had a total of 45 Bf-110s, just under 50 Bf-109Es, 29 Ju-88s, and 35 Ju-87s, although support could be called on from across the Mediterranean, subject to long delays. But above all, the Luftwaffe was let down by misaligned strategic and tactical demands from its leadership. In particular, diverging expectations between the local command, Fliegerführer Afrika, and the 10th Air Corps dented the full potential of German air power. Meanwhile, Germany never fully coordinated its ground operations, air defense, and air support in the region to the same extent as the British, and it meant German forces were well behind in terms of their air-land integration. This performance gap shone a light on the brilliance of two of the RAF's most formidable minds, Arthur Tedder and Arthur Conyngham, who were taking combined arms operations to a new level in North Africa. But Afrika Korps ground forces under Rommel were in a league of their own. Masters of maneuver warfare, the Afrika Korps imposed major setbacks on Britain's ground-based ambitions. This included Operation Battle Axe in June 1941, where Rommel's forces repelled a major British offensive even though the Afrika Korps was vastly outnumbered. Operation Battle Axe also exposed some residual flaws in Britain's approach to air-ground cooperation, as the Army and Air Force squabbled over the use of air power. These issues were resolved by new military leadership, meaning that, despite the defeat, the operation was important for refining Britain's emerging approach to combined arms tactics. The result was even greater inter-service cooperation, including an embedded communications and liaison network between the RAF and the Army. A lull in fighting prevailed following Operation Battle Axe, during which time the British ramped up aircraft deliveries to North Africa. By September 1941, the RAF had more fighters stationed in Egypt than were available at the outset of the Battle of Britain to defend the home islands. This included the arrival of US Lend-Leased P-40 Tomahawks, used by British, Australian, and South African squadrons. Ahead of Operation Crusader in November 1941, the RAF launched strikes on German airfields and Luftwaffe supply and logistics chains for several weeks. The success of these operations became clear as British ground forces advanced across Cyrenaica, in which at least 458 wrecked German and Italian aircraft were found on Axis airfields. Operation Crusader led to eventual short-term gains for the British. Rommel was pushed back to El Agheila, and the RAF was generally able to control the skies, although opposition from German fighter groups remained fierce. But a key factor for British success during Operation Crusader stemmed from RAF field crews and Army engineers who quickly repaired frontline airfields and built new airstrips under artillery fire, while delivering thousands of gallons of aviation fuel to facilitate forward aircraft deployment in an approach known as leapfrogging. The Luftwaffe lacked anything like this capability. This became increasingly clear as Rommel responded to Operation Crusader by launching a daring offensive thrust in January 1942, which pushed the British all the way back to Gazala. Whenever the Afrika Korps advanced beyond the short reach of the Luftwaffe, German and Italian forces were left dangerously exposed to the RAF. Lacking organization and mobility, Axis air power couldn't keep up with the fast-moving ground troops. And, at this point in the conflict, the RAF was deploying Hurricane Mark IID tank buster variants, fitted with two 40mm cannons under each wing. Although used in limited numbers, their effectiveness was so great they earned the nickname the Flying Can Openers. Despite these problems, the first half of 1942 was the Luftwaffe's brightest moment of the North African campaign. With the arrival of the Second Air Fleet to the Mediterranean from the Eastern Front at the end of 1941, the Luftwaffe now had three major formations in the region, including the 10th Air Corps in Greece and Crete, and the Fliegerführer Afrika in North Africa. As a result, German air strength in the Mediterranean had increased by over 50% by January 1942, a situation that enabled German and Italian air reinforcements to be deployed directly to North Africa. As Rommel advanced in the opening months of the year, RAF aircraft provided much-needed cover for the beleaguered British ground forces. Operational aircraft were flying up to 7 sorties a day in defense of the retreating 8th Army, in an astonishing feat that might have saved Britain's ground forces. Meanwhile, the fall of Tobruk on June 21, 1942, marked one of the most well-coordinated air-ground operations involving the Afrika Korps and the Luftwaffe during the North African campaign. Waves of Stuka dive bombers relentlessly targeted the southern sector of Tobruk's defenses, softening the perimeter for the Afrika Korps' assault. Rommel's forces breached the defenses, leading to the quick surrender of Tobruk, which was poorly prepared for a sustained fight. The Luftwaffe's strikes were pivotal in the rapid Axis victory, resulting in the capture of 45,000 Allied troops, along with significant amounts of tanks, artillery, and supplies. But as the British were beaten back to the El Alamein line, German air power was by this point vastly overstretched and unable to provide adequate cover for advancing land forces. And notably, Allied air strength was growing in terms of quality and the overall numbers of aircraft. By mid-1942, Spitfires from Malta and beyond were being stationed in North Africa in the air superiority role, offering a massive boost to the RAF's ability to take on the Bf-109F and control the skies. The US was also, at this point, directly intervening in the North African campaign through heavy bomber contributions. B-24 Liberators under the command of Harry A. Harvison, known as the Harvison Detachment, struck oil fields in Romania from British air bases in the Middle East in June, before striking Benghazi and the recently captured Tobruk on a regular basis. The delivery of additional US heavy bombers to the Middle East meant that by late July, under the banner of the 9th Air Force, 19 B-24s and 9 B-17s were operational. Their numbers were soon boosted by the addition of the 344th Bombardment Squadron of the 98th Group. The result was a massive uptick in heavy bomber activity. Between June and November, Tobruk was subject to almost 200 heavy bomber attacks by US aircraft in conjunction with RAF Wellingtons. As a result, by mid-August, the ports of Tobruk, Benghazi, and Mersa Matruh were operating at about 60% of their full capacity. At the same time, the buildup of American air power had deepened, with the arrival of P-40 fighter groups, B-25 medium bombers, and other aircraft at scale. The effect of joint British and American operations was immediate. Southbound Axis shipping to North African ports fell by 50% by the end of August, severely denting the supply of fuel and other supplies to German forces. Massive and continuous air raids on German landing strips and air facilities forced the Luftwaffe even further back from the front line. Rommel's next offensive against the 8th Army at the Battle of Alam el Halfa further showcased joint British and American air operations, with a mix of fighters, medium bombers, and ground attack aircraft delivering a punishing blow to German forces, which soon found themselves on the retreat. In the weeks that followed, relentless pressure was applied on the Luftwaffe by the RAF and the US Army Air Force via further attacks on airfields and infrastructure. Between early September and late October, 14 heavy, 219 medium, 595 light, and 333 fighter-bomber raids were conducted by the two countries. The cumulative toll on the Luftwaffe was immense, and by the time of the Second Battle of El Alamein, on October 23rd, the British 8th Army pushed forward safely in the knowledge that air superiority had been achieved. US air power had played an important contribution here, with attacks on Axis shipping and supply routes crippling important supplies required to sustain Luftwaffe operations. American fighters also proved more than a match for their German opponents, with most air-to-air encounters involving Bf-109s going the way of the US Army Air Force. As Rommel retreated across North Africa, heading back to El Agheila, US and British fighter squadrons continued the British tactic of leapfrogging, and in doing so, ensured fighter aircraft were stationed on airstrips at the front line. This helped to keep the pressure on retreating German forces, who faced constant assault from the skies. By the time the depleted Germans had reached El Agheila in late November, there was little hope of holding what had previously been a strong defensive position. Allied fighter attacks on Luftwaffe airstrips forced German air units to retreat more than 90 miles behind the front line. Rommel withdrew from the position in mid-December, but carefully dispersed his forces to minimize any large targets for British and American aircraft. As the year drew to an end, Axis forces were also contending with Allied air and land power in the west, thanks to the success of the invasion of French North Africa in mid-November. Ultimate defeat beckoned for the Germans and their junior partners.